All right, our next guest is currently a philosopher at the Australian Catholic University after getting her PhD from ANU in 2013. At the moment, she mostly writes about group responsibility, collective duties, the obligations of organisations, and how that's not just three ways of saying the same thing. Her first book, The Core of Care Ethics, came out in 2015, and her next book, Group Duties, will be out sometime in 2019. Please put your hands together again. Bring it up with some cheers. And welcome to the stage, Steph Collins.
Cool. Thanks. So, does this come out? You sure? Am I just weak? Oh, no, good. Cool. So, like John, I thought that the title of tonight's event was Ineffective Altruism, The Dangers of Doing Good. But unlike John, I need notes, so I'm like him in one way, but not another. Okay, good. All right, so here's, let me start with this. Here's an obvious thought, right? If you're going to be altruistic, then you should try to be effective. I take it that probably seems so obvious, it's kind of not even worth saying. So I'm going to assume that that's not worth saying, and instead I want to try and spend the next 20 minutes giving you the case for ineffective altruism. This is why it matters what I thought the title was. So I want to try and give you the moral case, I want to try and give you an ethical argument for why effectiveness is not the main thing that you should think about when you're being altruistic. Okay, so before I get on to doing that, I'm going to say something about what I take effective altruism to be. So effective altruism, as I understand it, is a social movement consisting primarily of people sort of like me and possibly like you. So kind of social justice warrior, millennials, vegans, eating avocado on toast, locked out of the property market, who have kind of chronic guilt over their first world privilege. This is the really important bit, the chronic first world privilege guilt. And because effective altruists are trapped in that guilt, as probably most people in this room are, they are therefore engaged in a particular project. So that project is, when they're thinking about giving to like moral or social or political causes, they try to get the most bang for their buck, right? And the way in which they do that is the following. For every cent and every second and every kilojoule that they exert towards moral and social and political causes, they ask themselves, how can I produce the most well-being with this cent or second or kilojoule that I'm giving? Okay, how can I produce the most well-being? And by well-being, they mean roughly something like happiness and pleasure and love and knowledge and art and human connection and all the good things, right? Okay, so that's the idea. So to illustrate, right, because I'm a philosopher, I need to do thought experiments, that's my whole job. To illustrate, you're walking down the street, right, you find $5 on the street, and you're altruistic, so you decide you're going to give this $5 to charity, and suppose you're tossing up between two charities. Okay, so on the one hand, you've got this charity, Refugee Action Coalition, which, yes? No? Okay. You all hate refugees, yeah. So Refugee Action Coalition, I guess, which is an Australian organisation that lobbies the Australian government to try and get the government to respect the human rights of the refugees that Australia currently has detained on Manus Island and Nauru for offshore processing of their asylum claims. So that's your one option, that's your first charity you could give to. Second charity you could give to, that you're tossing up about, is the Against Malaria Foundation. Cheers for that. If you're an effective altruist, you basically have to cheer that. Okay, no effective altruist. Okay, yeah. Yay, woo, effective altruism. Okay. So the Against Malaria Foundation works in sub-Saharan Africa, in malaria-prone regions, distributing bed nets that have been coated with anti-mosquito stuff, so that people can put those bed nets over their beds, they don't get bitten by mosquitoes, they don't get malaria. Okay, cool. So those are the two things you're tossing up between with this $5 in your hand. Now, you ask your effective altruist friend what you should do, which of these two charities you should give to, and your effective altruist friend, there he is, hi Peter, I love you. I don't. I don't. That's a lie. I'm arguing against him. I'm trying to. So your effective altruist friend here will tell you that this is what you should do. You should go on the internet. You should go to givewell.com, because there you will find a list of charities listed according to how much well-being they produce for every dollar they receive. And your effective altruist friend, Peter, will say that you should give to whichever of the charities is ranked highest on that list. Now, I didn't pick these charities out of thin air. As it turns out, the malaria charity consistently gets top of these kinds of rankings. The malaria charity, this anti-malaria foundation, does really well on these rankings. Refugee Action Coalition isn't listed by GiveWell, and there are reasons for that. GiveWell probably haven't investigated about the Refugee Action Coalition, because it's very likely that that particular charity doesn't score very well in terms of how much well-being it produces per dollar donated. Why? Well, there aren't that many people on Manus Island and Nauru compared to the number of people who are potential victims of malaria. So Peter says, give your $5 to Anti-Malaria Foundation rather than to Refugee Action Coalition. That's the effective altruist idea. Okay. So I have two gripes with this, two reasons why I think we should actually be ineffective altruists of a certain variety. So the gripes are to do with justice on the first hand and democracy on the second. So keeping things lighthearted. Cool. Trying to. Okay, good. So first of all, the justice complaint. So the justice worry is this. The effective altruist, this person who wants to produce as much well-being as they can, basically treats well-being as this kind of magical juice that's sloshing around in the world, and the aim of being altruistic is just to produce as much of this magical juice as you can, without being concerned for who's getting the magical juice, right? We just want to promote as much well-being as we can, not worried about who's getting it, that doesn't matter. But according to many philosophers, myself included, you can have duties of justice to give the magical well-being juice to some people rather than others, and it can be important that you do that even if that's not the way to produce as much well-being juice as you can. So, example, because again, thought experiments, philosopher. Suppose, I'll use a non-charitable organisation example to start with. Suppose that John, wherever he's gone, the comedian who was here before, suppose that he and Peter have each been locked out of their houses by their housemates. Peter's rich, he probably doesn't have housemates, but imagine he does. Okay, and so imagine they've both been locked out of their houses because their housemates hate them for whatever reason. That doesn't matter. Their housemates are dicks. I have a spare room in my house. I've decided I'm going to be altruistic. I've decided I'm going to let one of them sleep in my spare room. I only have room for one of them. Whatever, it's a thought experiment. Okay, so who do I give my spare room to? There are two ways to answer this question. So the effective altruist answer is the answer that you get if you think about what philosophers call duties of beneficence. So the effective altruist answer is give the spare room to whoever would get the most well-being from it. So let's suppose, just for the sake of argument, that John, the guy who was up here before, is the person that would get the most well-being from it. Maybe he has to cry himself to sleep because his comedy was so shit or something. So I don't know. I wouldn't say that if the comedy was actually bad, though, right? That's the thing about jokes. So, okay. Anyway, it's not putting me off. So suppose John will get the most well-being from the room. So then the effective altruist says I should give the spare room to John. Okay, easy. So that's duties of beneficence. They would agree with that assessment. So to introduce duties of justice, we need to add some more facts to the story. So actually, it turns out Peter and I are housemates. This is definitely not true, but for the sake of the story, it turns out Peter and I are housemates, and I'm the asshole that locked Peter out of his house. Right? So now I've got this spare room. It's not actually spare, it's Peter's room. I've kicked him out of the house because I hate him for whatever reason. So I've got this spare room that I can let someone have. It's still true that John would get the most well-being out of the room, right? But it's Peter's room. I violated his rights by locking him out of our shared house. I infringed his autonomy, I disrespected him as a rational agent, I wronged him These are the kind of terminology philosophers would use to describe this, right? So I did wrong by him. I violated a duty that I had to him. And so it looks like, I assume most people would agree, I'm not going to do a show of hands in case it pushes against me. I assume most people would agree, actually I should give the room to Peter. It's his room in his house, even though John would get the most well-being from the room. Okay, so there are some cases, at least that case, right, for example, in which we should follow our duties of justice rather than our duties of beneficence. So, transfer this back to the case we are thinking about which charity to give to. So you're tossing up between Refugee Action Coalition on the one hand and Against Malaria Foundation on the other. Now, here's what I would say. The refugees who are currently being detained by the Australian state on Manus Island in Nauru are being detained by a collective agent of which Australian citizens are a part. Right? So if you're an Australian citizen, you can probably hear that I'm not, but if you are, don't worry, my state's done tons of bad shit as well, so I still get loads of these kinds of duties. If you're an Australian citizen, then you're part of the creature that has duties of justice to correct the harms that are being done to those refugees. So the Australian state has duties of justice to those refugees because it's violated their rights, infringed their autonomy, disrespected their humanity, etc. And because you're a component part of that state, you get duties on that basis, duties of justice. Now, I'm assuming we probably have some Green voters in the House, because this is like North Melbourne. But I want to say that even if you're a Green voter, even if you've only ever voted Green, and so you've always voted effectively against this offshore processing of asylum claims, it's still true that you get these duties because they're not about individual wrongdoing. It's not that you as an individual have wronged the refugees, it's that you're part of this group that has. And this generalises way beyond the refugee case, right? So the Australian state, again, my state's done this too, but the Australian state has done tons of bad shit. Like, think about how it's treated its Aboriginal population, or think about its policies on climate change. So as a member of a state like that, you get tons of duties of justice. And you also get tons of duties of justice just from your involvement in the economy. So like John mentioned, the children who make us expensive shoes, right? I think that's a source of duties of justice, that you're complicit in sweatshop labour, in fucking conflict minerals with your smartphones, fueling wars in Africa and whatever. So duties of justice kind of threaten to swamp our lives. And depending on how you weigh up the duties of justice and the duties of beneficence, there might not be that much room left for beneficence. I mean, I think duties of justice don't necessarily completely outweigh duties of beneficence, but they certainly have equal weight. So that means you're not going to be as effective as you can all the time. Okay, so that's the justice gripe. How am I doing for time? Okay, good. Right, on to democracy. So, refugees rather than malaria, maybe, sometimes. Okay, on to democracy. So democracy, this is a completely separate rant, so you can forget about the justice stuff for a second. So imagine that you're like an alien who was planted down on Earth yesterday, so you have no duties of justice. Fine, okay. So now you find this $5 on the street, and you ask yourself the question, which charity should I give it to? And you're like, hey, I'm not an Australian citizen, so I don't have to give it to the refugee charity. I'm an alien, I'm not a member of any state, and I haven't violated anyone's rights, so I have no duties of justice. Great, so I'm giving it to malaria. Okay, so I think even if you're an alien that has no duties of justice, it's still problematic that you give it to the malaria charity because of democracy. So the thought here is this. When people in, say, Ghana, just to pick a particular country that the malaria charity works in, if people in Ghana get these bed nets as a result of you giving to the malaria charity, then they're getting the bed nets on the basis of the whims and preferences and flights of fancy of some affluent people on the other side of the world, right? So it would be better, presumably, if they instead got the bed nets via democratic laws that were made by their state. Why would that be better? because then they could hold the state to account if the state didn't do what it said it was going to do, could chuck the politicians out in the next round, right? It could claim those bed nets in some kind of meaningful sense. But there's no way for people in Ghana to claim bed nets from you, or even from the charity that you give to. Like, that charity isn't accountable to them, right? In the same way that a democratic state is accountable to them. So it's better, let's assume, well, I think it's true, but I'm going to assume you're with me on this, that they get the bed nets from democratic laws, that those things are owed to them as a matter of democratic right, that they have control over, rather than getting it from charity. In fact, if you buy my line about citizens being part of the state in a democracy, then when Ghanaians get those bed nets from the state, they're actually getting the bed nets from themselves, in a sense. Right? They're getting it from other richer Ghanaians, of course, but they're all part of this machine that's doing it to itself. So there's something good there about respecting their agency. Okay. So if you think that's right, that it's better to get well-being, the magical well-being juice, via democratic laws rather than via charity, then it looks like you should be giving to causes, to campaigns, to groups, to charities that aim to promote democratic institution building. So you're not just giving the well-being juice directly, you're trying to contribute to people being able to get the well-being juice for themselves via democratic laws. But if you're concerned about doing that, then you're probably going to be giving to charities like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, which again aren't on these lists of charities that produce the most well-being. Again, why? Because it's really hard to measure how much well-being juice gets brought about by these kinds of political charities. And also because getting bed nets as a matter of democratic law isn't really a matter of having more well-being. Right? So if I'm getting the bed nets from democratic law, and we compare that to a world in which I'm getting the bed nets from charity, my well-being is kind of the same in both. Like, in both cases, I don't have malaria. But in one of those worlds, the democratic world, I'm being respected as a rational agent. That's not about my well-being. Most philosophers would argue. That's kind of contentious, but most philosophers would argue. So it's not really factored into the effective altruist project. And even if they do try and factor it in, it's so impossible to measure, and it's so kind of incomparable to the other kinds of things that get packed into our well-being that you can't really factor it into these charity ranking measurement things. Okay. And even if the effective altruist wants to say, no, democracy is good and that's part of your well-being, so live in a democracy, so yeah, we think you should give to democracy-building charities. Even if the effective altruist tries to say that, they still have another problem, I think, which is this. Democratic institution building is not something that any individual can do, right? It's something that only gets done by individuals acting together as a team. And so when you think about the good that you can do, even if you include democracy as part of what's good, if you think about the good that you can do by giving to, say, Amnesty International, your giving is going to be really a drop in the ocean. It's going to make such a tiny difference, your individual giving, if you give to Amnesty. Whereas if you give to the malaria charity, that's pretty much guaranteed to buy about 2 bed nets. Like, that's pretty certain good. So even if you try and include the good of democratic lawmaking within your understanding of what it means to have well-being, the effective altruist is still going to say that you might not have duties to give to charities that build democratic institutions because you don't make much difference on your own in that kind of case. Problem is, of course, if everyone reasoned like that, so if everyone thought, well, I'm not going to make much difference to institution building, so I'll just give to the malaria charity because I can create 2 bed nets that way. If everyone thought like that, we wouldn't get any institution building. No one would contribute to that. But if everyone refused to think like an effective altruist, if everyone thought, no, I'm not going to think about the difference that I make, I'm instead going to think about the difference we could make together if everyone did this thing, if everyone thought like that, then we would get democratic institution building. So it's all getting a bit complicated, but what I'm trying to say is, if you want to do the most good, you have to not think like an effective altruist, because you have to not think about the good that you do individually on your own. You have to think about the good that we can do together. And it seems like yeah, wow, it's good. Thank you. I was worried about that bit. I wasn't sure I'd have time to do justice to that bit, so good. Right, so it seems like the effective altruist mindset of the difference I can do with my little $5 isn't really capturing that thought. Okay, so that's all I got to say. I should wrap up. In closing, I just want to note one thing. The flavour of ineffective altruism that I've been trying to push is still super demanding. Sorry. So duties of justice and duties to build democratic institutions are numerous and probably going to take our whole lives to fulfill, and probably will never fulfill them, and they still take up a lot of our time and money and energy and so on. So sorry if you were hoping that I was going to convince you that you get to do nothing. My brand of ineffective altruism doesn't get you that, but it does get the well-being juice to the right people, the people that we owe it to as a matter of justice, and it gets it to them in the right kind of way via democratic institutions, and that seems good. So I'll leave it there. Cool.
Steph Collins.